So this is a video about consent, but not in the way you might think it is. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we will be talking about 6 Lives, the new novel by Lavie Tidhar, which came out yesterday. No, it came... Alright, it came out yesterday. And, yeah, I've read it. I enjoyed it. Biggest surprise, I know. And we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis, tell you why you should go and read it, and then we'll talk about some details that I found interesting that stood out to me, and those parts will involve spoilers, as far as you can have spoilers in these kind of videos. And, yeah, I'll warn you by drinking beer when that happens. No, not every time me drinking beer means that there will be more spoilers afterwards. It could be that case, but only in the most theoretical way of that being true. Anyway, let's get started, right? All right. 6 Lives is a connected story. It's a novel, the back cover says so, that has 6 parts, 6 lives, 6 stories basically that are linked together. Now that's obviously something we've seen before. There are, in science fiction, you have a bunch of these mosaic novels where you have, you know, tied together stuff like Pavan by Keith Roberts, or I'm blanking obviously A Canticle for Leibowitz, and a lot of those kind of things. This is sort of similar, but also different. And there's a parallel to another book I think I really enjoyed, which is a version by Alistair Reynolds, and we'll come to why that is the case later. So we have 6 stories that are focusing on one character each, and each of these stories, they move forward in time slowly from the mid-19th century to the, well, basically now, more or less, the early 21st century. And all the characters are connected by one way or another through well, sort of relationships and inheritance and so forth, and they're all tied to one banking house, that being the banking house of Thebes. And the book examines how those things happen, how these people show up in different key situations of the last 200 years of history, and each of them has, like, a plot in its own. Some of them are mysteries, some of them are more detective stories, some of them are war stories, and so forth. And that's sort of what you get. You get like 6 shorter stories that all tie together into a larger story that is thematically, they're all thematically linked in one way or another. So if you like historical stories, you know, placed in all kinds of places on this globe over the last 200 years, this is very much a book that will definitely have something for you. If you're into the 19th century, that's cool. If you're into, you know, early 20th century Irish resistance and stuff like that, that is cool. If you're into, like, 1930s crime fiction, this is in here. If you're, like, into 60s, 70s Cold War spy fiction, this is in here. If you're into, well, more modern stories about art, the cinema, whatever, this is also in here. And this is, I think, the strength of this book. There will be something for you if you're into broadly historical realist fiction. There is no supernatural element in these books. So, yeah. This kind of follows on from both Maror and Adama, where Tidhar also went for the straight-up historical storytelling, and it kind of has a lighter tone, mostly, than those 2 novels, and by being spread all over the globe, it is also obviously not as focused on Israel as those 2 novels. So, yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. Even if one story doesn't click with you, others will probably do so. So, I don't know, go read it. It's not that long. It'll be entertaining. You'll learn a lot of stuff about places that you didn't know much before. So, why not try it, right? So, yeah, this is why you should go and read it. Now, I'll have a bit of beer, and then we'll talk about some details that I found interesting in this. All right, let's start with the first part, and this is why I said it kind of reminds me a bit of a version by Alistair Reynolds, which I loved, to make this very clear. And that is that each of these stories in this, well, novel has a different style, and that style shifts with the genre they're kind of set in. If you remember, Eversion goes through, like, different parts of the science fiction genre. This kind of goes through different genres in general. You have the 19th century story that is a bit more Victorian, a bit more lavish, elaborate, and so forth. Then we have our Irish story in the 1912, mostly, that is much more focused on, the landscape there, the personal stuff, in a lot of ways. Then we have our 1930s, the Country House Murder, which is very clearly inspired by Agatha Christie and other crime fiction authors of the time, and uses that style in a lot of ways. And then we have our 1960s part in Cairo, which is very heavily inspired by Cold War fiction, Cold War spy thrillers, both on the cinematic and, of course, the novel. And it uses that vocabulary. It uses those kind of, sceneries, tropes, and so forth. And then we move on into like the 1980s when we have the film star thing, which mostly uses flashbacks to examine the life of Miriam and tying those things together, and looking obviously at glamour and how you can enter or not enter it if you are not, a white American or maybe white European. It looks at those kind of elements. And then we have the 2000s one with Isabella, which is very much your contemporary. I don't want to categorize it much more because I don't read most of those kind of novels, but like very much the young 20-something person being adrift and trying to figure out who they are kind of novel in that regard. And it uses tropes of that, and we'll examine how these things work in a bit. So this is the first part that I found is interesting, switching style within the novel to indicate where we're at, because that allows the author, in this case Tidhar, to look at, to pull on memory on what Umberto Eco would call our personal encyclopedia, which means all the other stuff we know from these time periods, from these genres, are sort of in the back of our mind and allow us to open and read this text and make connections that would otherwise require much more explanation and so forth. And they help us set the theme and figure out what is going on. And that's a very classic sort of advantage of using tropes, of using specific time settings and so forth. And all authors do that up to a point. I think it is incredibly well done here by, shifting style. And the next part, references. See, all of these, and one of the main tools that Tidhar has always used, at least in his more realist fiction, is cultural references, pop culture references. And you have all the music references in stuff like Maror or Adama. And here you have a lot of these depending on which time we're in. So in the 19th century, we obviously have some Marx references, because socialism is something that is currently being discussed in the mid-19th century. We also have obviously, some fun references there being, obviously, for me personally, William Blake references, which, I personally just enjoyed. And we have a lot of these sort of references. Charles Dickens is clearly an inspiration there as well. I personally found the whole dining stuff with Edward at the beginning, when he goes with his clerk friends to different bars and stuff, really reminded me of the Diaries of Samuel Pepys, which, why would you ever read those? Unless you want to know how much meat and alcohol a 17th century civil servant can eat in like 1 week. It's a lot. But so we have that. And then we have the early 20th century, where we have a lot of references to different parts of Ireland and Irish culture and the IRA and all of that stuff. And what I personally found interesting there, and we'll come back to that later, it reminded me very much of for example, the first part of King of Morning, Queen of Day by Ian MacDonald, in the way it portrays Ireland, and also in the way it portrays, these other places that are across the sea, whether it's England or the United States. And it uses, once again, references to songs and cultural elements there in a way to signal where we are and shift the mood, and it does that very well. Then obviously in the 1930s we have the Agatha Christie reference there, and there's something fun happening here, which is maybe the most supernatural element in here, and I think it makes sense to have that in here, which is that we have both a Lord Homewood and we have someone working for the civil service, working as a spy, being named Harker. And the question there is, of course, why is there a Dracula reference in this? Or am I just seeing too much? And I think this is sort of where we come to the interpretation versus over-interpretation kind of thing that Umberto Eco also pulls out sometimes, right? Am I seeing too much here when I'm already aware that there are literary references and I'm Gollumified, I guess. References and So I'm seeing some that are not necessarily there, or are these just like Easter eggs? Because, Dracula being written in the late 19th century does sort of hint at that, and this is sort of like the next generation in a lot of ways talking about here. And it's just like a fun thing. You can see these bits and go like, wow, there's another Agatha Christie reference. There's another Bram Stoker reference. Here's maybe an Arthur Conan Doyle reference. And picking these up is fun for those of us who recognize them, but we don't have to. But it still helps to set that whole thing, right? Having, the murder on the country club, having Harker in this case come in and have like the big reference, like scene where he does the big reveal of who could be the murderer, having everyone sit together in one room, and you get my drift. It's fun in a lot of ways, but it also does cover something more serious that we'll come to in a moment. Then we obviously have the 1960s part, which is set in Cairo and does have obviously clearly some John le Carré references, I guess. Very much some Hitchcock, The Man Who Knew Too Much kind of elements. With obviously that movie is set in more like further northern Africa, in I think Marrakesh and that place, roughly. It's been years since I watched it. It also reminded me a lot of Declare by Tim Powers, for example, which also takes place in parts of the Middle East. It mostly takes place in Lebanon, but especially with the historical references of what's his name, Edward Waverley, being very clearly inspired by Kim Philby in a lot of ways, and Edith Hoffman, who shows up in the chapter before, is clearly a mix, or at least a reference to one of the potential people that potentially pulled Kim Philby back in the day. She was also named Edith, I forgot her last name, not Hoffman, it was a different one, who pulled Kim Philby into becoming a double agent for the British and the Soviet. And then obviously in that fourth chapter, we meet him after his defection in Russia. Fun thing, if you want to try, if you want to see all about Kim Philby's defection, go read Declare by Tim Powers. It's a wonderful novel in that regard. And then we move on towards, the 80s, where we have a lot of movie references in there. And my favorite one is that Miriam mentions that she did like voiceover for a Ralph Bakshi short film, which, yeah, that's awesome. But it also talks a lot about, Italian movies from the 70s and B movies in a lot of ways. And the interesting part here is that, of course, as a person born in Egypt, which had its own movie industry that we over here in the West don't know much about, for actresses and actors from these places, from the non-West, not from the US and Western Europe, basically, one of the few ways of breaking into the movie industry is playing both extras and starring in what you might call B movies, in all kinds of ways, stuff that goes directly to VHS, back then, direct to video stuff. And it kind of mentions all of that. There's clearly a similarity to some of the topics that Silvia Moreno Garcia talked about in her recent novel, The Seventh Whale of Salome, which you also should go and read. And then we obviously have the timing in the final story with a Rihanna song being the phone ringtone for Isabella and things like that. And so once again, we have these very specific pop culture things that will tie us into the time and place of that story, that helps set the mood of the story, but that also, and this is, I think, important here, can be sort of like Easter eggs that some of us will recognize and some of us won't recognize. Because if you haven't read Dracula, you will probably forget that it was Sir Arthur Holmwood who was supposed to marry Lucy Weston-Raleigh. You probably recognize the name of Harker, but both together sort of build up that thing, right? And if you've read something like Declare, you'll recognize more of these elements and in the Kim Philby story, unless you have spent way too much time reading up about the Cambridge Five, which are pushed to Oxford in this specific novel. But that's sort of like the main thing that I wanted to talk about, how pop culture references shift in style and help to establish different stories. So let's move on from that. I think like one of the points that I just wanted to make sure quickly here is that we can also read this as Tidhar paying some form of homage to fellow writers. I've already mentioned, Ian MacDonald's King of Morning, Queen of Day, and those kind of stuff in the Irish Story. I've mentioned Agatha Christie, and obviously there's his version of like a fellow crime fiction writer, Edna St. James, I think is her name. I'm really bad with names. In the next part, we have, I would read them as maybe some Tim Powers references or homage to Tim Powers' style of telling a crime fiction story, and specifically in Declare in the fourth story in the Vasily part. And obviously we can read this as a Silvia Moreno Garcia reference in the fifth story. So we can read this as writers being sort of putting in these references to each other's books and so forth in a way that has always been part of both genre fiction and fiction, literary fiction at large. So it's just relatively easy for a reader to pick out if we feel like it. But once again, this is the difference between interpretation and overinterpretation. This may just be me having read too many books and making the wrong connections here. So I just wanted to point this out. You can do this, is my point. Now let's talk about the next part. Literature is always political. Art is always political. I've said that a ton of times, and I think one of the main things that we can learn from this novel is that no matter which genre Tidhar kind of picks, whether it's the adventure novel, the 19th century adventure novel, whether it is the early 20th century sort of nationalist Irish pastoral, whatever you want to call it, story, whether it is the 1930s crime fiction, detective tale, whether it's the 1970s, 60s, 70s spy fiction, all of these deal with very political topics that we'll talk about in a second. So what this novel shows is that no matter the genre, you will always be able to talk about politics. And you can't avoid talking about politics no matter what you do, simply because art and politics are so interlinked. And showcasing this in like 6 different genres in one novel, I think, is just a very neat way of showing that and approving that, I think. So let's talk about the politics, shall we? And it's interesting to look at what this book does here, and I think it's there is a shift in this book. Like, clearly, this book talks about colonialism and imperialism. It's very simple. We begin with the first story with an English banker having to go to Peru to look at the guano money of the colonial and imperialist exploitation of America, of Latin America, South America in this case. But we also have already the thing in the beginning when he meets that prostitute, which is Irish. So we also see that England has always been a colonial power when it comes to Ireland, which we'll obviously come back to later. So we have 2 parts of colonialism here, or imperialism, which, Ireland being at this part a colony oppressed by Britain, whereas Lima and Peru around that part are not officially part of the British Empire. They are just exploited through monetary means. And this is, I think, one of the main sort of themes that we can see shift throughout the story, is how from an overt military colonialism and imperialism through the British Empire, we slowly shift to an economic imperialist exploitation of different places. And we move one step further, because, yes, we have the banking house of Thebes being always present in one way, shape or form, always profiteering from suffering of the other, from exploitation, imperialist exploitation in one way or another. But we slowly shift from the banking house to individuals. And I think this is the key part that I think is important here, because while it is possible for states to exploit and use their imperial force in an economic way, we can talk about sanctions, we can talk about international development money and stuff like that, and that is certainly happening. What also happens over the last 200 years is a shift from states as actors moving towards individual organizations. In this case, it's the banking house of Thebes, and then focusing from the banking house of Thebes to individual incredibly rich people. But the mechanism still remains the same. People have mostly monetary power that they use to change the world according to their rules. And for this, I think it's important to look at how these stories are structured. The first character is, of course, a minor Thebes who kind of takes over the Thebes banking house. And that is the first character. But from then on, the actual Thebes people who have the name of Thebes and are allowed to be to wield that monetary power are always they're secondary characters. They are people that our main characters or focus characters for each story have to interact with and are oftentimes pushed around, right? In the second story, it's the granddaughter of that prostitute that Edward Phoebes has sex with in the first story, and that second time, that second line, so to speak, that our focus characters are then obviously symbolized through that pocket watch that he gives to the flowers girl in the first story. That is then handed on from person to person to person, and I think that is a very interesting and very powerful way of doing that. First of all, looking at that pocket watch, which looks golden but is actually cheap in a lot of ways. So it's people that are sort of blinded or at least fooled by the attraction of gold, the attraction of money, the attraction of power, but also constantly used by the people that actually have power, right? That's something we see in these stories. When we move forward to the third one, which is, technically the great-grandson of Edward Phoebes, but he doesn't know that until that point. He has that watch. He doesn't actually know what to do, but when he comes to the country club, to the country seat of the Phoebes family, it's very clear that everyone there is pushed around by the family of Phoebes through power in a lot of ways. And he still sort of fights against that, struggles with it in a lot of ways, but when we move to Vasily, we have step one further way back. He interacts with Edward, is it Edward? I think it's Edward, in our Kim Philby stand-in in Moscow, and gets the pocket watch from him for just whatever reason. And this is sort of where things get funny, right? He hands it on to Soraya, who hands it on to their daughter, and so forth. But in those stories, suddenly it is the next woman of the House of Phoebes, whose name I have just forgotten because I'm really bad at this. Anyway, so suddenly she's just in the background as an individual doing individual things. She's not necessarily even acting for the House of Phoebes. She's just using her financial power to, do some maybe some spy stuff in that fourth story. But in the fifth story, when she just shows up to pick up Miriam and sort of support her, or being in the background when she pulls her into the movie career, she's only acting as an individual, and possibly just out of maybe interest or whatever, maybe because she recognized that she's the daughter of Vasily from the fourth story. And then in the fifth story, it's just like her enforcing her will on Isabella because she can. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at this, because it shows that once you are part of a specific economic elite, you have powers that other people have not, and you can just pull people into your orbit and do whatever you want. And that's still sort of like a form of, I can't probably call it imperialism, but the mechanism is still the same. You're using your superior monetary funds and so forth to wield power over others. You ignore those, you possibly exploit them. And the question is, like, how do you get out of that? Because clearly there's a cost for it. Because you stop being part of the, of humanity in that regard. You lose skills that kind of come with interacting with everyday humanity on a daily basis. You don't do that anymore. And we can see in that final story with Isabella and her, stepmother, adoptive mother in this case, how they struggle to figure that out because they never learned. And I found that a very interesting way of looking at it, and the way the whole story ends up with Isabella then going to the pub called Annie's, which clearly is the pub that Annie from the second story wanted to found when she came to the US. We don't know if she actually got there, because obviously she went on the Titanic, or if it's just some of the Doyles that she hung out with in Ireland opened it in her name afterwards. We don't know that, but with the Phoebes watch being like the last part of the not actually part of the elite side of the Phoebes family being returned to Annie, or Annie's bar in that case, we sort of see how the whole thing kind of comes full circle, and that I think is interesting, because it means that once this circle of exploitation, power, and so forth is closed, Isabella can go off and become her own person and do her own thing. She gives up that dependency, and that I think is what lies at the core of this. Is like, how do we get out of this? Because wielding power can cause harm to oneself, and being the subject of power is also incredibly harmful. And the question is, like, is there a way for us to get out of that? And the sad part is the person who wields that power has to give up that power willingly, which is obviously what happens when she donates all her money to that charity and just leaves Isabella to, do her own thing and not be attached to the family of Phoebes in whatever dependency way that is there. And I think that's a very, very powerful message, that it means those who have power have to give it up willingly, so those of us who don't have power are finally free of being subjected to that power. Will that ever happen? I don't know. But that's I think, at the core of the political message in this, one of the political messages in here, the shift from like full-on military, political imperial power to an economic imperialist power to a personal imperialist power, which is obviously what happens with neoliberalism as a political system that shifts power back to personal or individual elites in a lot of ways. So that's the core of it. 2 or 3 final things. I love the fact that there's so many homosexual characters, gay characters in this, both male homosexuals and lesbians in here, or at least sometimes hinted at, and how that is obviously clearly illegal in the 1920s and 1930s, and how people have to struggle with this. Alan Turing doesn't show up, but his ghost sort of hovers over the 1930s and 1940s in a lot of ways. All of that, I think, makes for an interesting read in a lot of ways. As I said, the pop culture stuff is just fun. The way the Dark Satanic Mills got mentioned, which is one of my favorite Blake phrases because it just is so good. Yeah, it's just like highly engaging, having a deeper meaning underneath all of that about the human cost of being in a system of power. It's meaningful, it's powerful. I enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it if you've read it already. If you haven't read it, let me know what you think about it down in the comments. Like, subscribe, do the things. There's a Patreon if you want to give me money. And I don't know, I'll be back talking about something else, possibly Desolation Road by Ian MacDonald next. And until then, thanks and cheers.